So welcome, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Mark Ledbury. I'm speaking to you from the University of Sydney, and as I'm on Gadigal land, never ceded and never sold, always was and always will be, I wish to acknowledge the profound and enduring debt that we owe to the Aboriginal custodianship of country and pay my respect to the elders of the Eora Nation, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge too that our speakers in this digital event are themselves speaking to us from many other of the lands and countries of Australia's First Peoples. And I'm delighted that you've been able to join us on behalf of Griffith Art Museum and the Power publication. We're all here to discuss the art and writing practice of the late Gordon Bennett, one of Australia's most important contemporary artists, and most excitingly, to hear his own words as delivered by our esteemed guests, Kelly Gillatly, Judy Watson, Stephen Gilchrist, and Tim Riley Walsh. First, I'd like to, if you'd mind, to take a moment to celebrate the project from which this event has arisen, our co-publication, Gordon Bennett, Selected Writings. I don't know if you can see this rather splendid book that I'm holding up here and whether it's in mirror or not, but it's really a wonderful publication, the first really to survey Bennett's writing practice. Bennett was an alumnus of Griffith University's Queensland College of Art, and this collection has been co-edited by Griffith University Art Museum Director Angela Goddard and art historian Tim Riley Walsh, who we'll hear from a bit later. It's a stunning publication, it's wonderful. It was produced on the traditional lands of the Gadigal, the Yugara and the Turrbal peoples. It was made possible with the generous support and collaboration of Leanne Bennett and the estate of Gordon Bennett, which is represented by Milani Gallery in Brisbane and Sutton Gallery in Melbourne. And the Queensland government provided key financial support through Arts Queensland. And as we're launching this book today, and sadly, we'd normally be toasting you with at least a glass of wine if it was a regular book launch, but I hope you have a cup of coffee at least handy. I'd like to also thank and acknowledge not only the editors, but also the marvellous editorial team, the brilliant Marnie Williams from Power Publications, Michael Phillips for such an inspired design, Evie Francidis for her fastidious edits, and Mandy Quadrio for her editorial assistance. And the result of their amazing work opens up the discussion of Bennett's intersecting art and writing practice through nearly 40 published and unpublished essays, artist statements, letters, and interviews. It's a real treasure trove. And of course, the book coincides with the exhibition Unfinished Business, The Art of Gordon Bennett, which is currently at Corgoma in Brisbane, the first large-scale showing of Bennett's work since 2007. And so the book and the discussion today are really about hearing Bennett in his own words. And we can see here that word from the book and from what you'll hear in a moment, that words were extremely important to him. Bennett's voice shifts between scholarly debate, political argument, polemic, personal reflections, and reveals that in his practice, he considered art and life to be as entangled as words and images. And to deliver Bennett's voice and help us with those entanglements and exploring them and elucidating them are four eminent speakers. And I'm just going to introduce all four, and they will then, their discussions and their readings will flow on one from another. So first up will be Kelly Gillatly, an arts advocate, curator and writer, the former director of the Ian Potter Museum of Art from the University of Melbourne from 2013 to 2020, and before that, curator of contemporary art at the National Gallery of Victoria from 2003 to 2013. She's held also curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Australia and at Heidi Museum of Modern Art. After her, will speak Judy Watson, one of who will need no introduction, I know, to many of you, but one of Australia's most significant contemporary artists. Watson's Aboriginal matrilineal family are from Wanya country in northwest Queensland, and she's exhibited widely, as you all know, over the past 25 years, including at Venice and Sydney Biennales, and her work features in many Australian and international collections. It's a real delight that Judy's been able to join us. Stephen Gilchrist, my wonderful colleague, belongs to the Amachi people of the Ngada language group of Northwestern Australia. He's lecturer in Indigenous art at the University of Sydney. Before joining us from 2012 to 2016, he was the Australian Studies visiting curator at the Harvard Art Museums and Harvard University, and he's worked curating and thinking with Indigenous Australian collections and exhibitions and artworks in Australia and around the world. Tim Riley Walsh, who I semi-introduced before, is an emerging art historian and curator based in Brisbane and the co-editor of this book. Is the Australia desk editor for Art Asia Pacific, Hong Kong, and he's a post-thesis fellow within the School of Communication and Arts at University of Queensland. He is, of course, the co-editor of this book, Gordon Bennett, Selected Writing. So I'm going to first pass over the mic to Kelly. Welcome, Kelly, and thank you very much to all four of you.
Mark, thank you so much. As you said, I live and work in Melbourne's outer eastern suburbs on the edge of the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong, not far from Mullumbullen Creek, which is one of the only watercourses lying within urban metropolitan Melbourne that's surrounded by native and regenerated bushland for almost its entire length. This watercourse is now a significant remnant ecosystem in Melbourne, but it was, of course, a source of food, of resources for tools, and a place of gathering and creativity for the Kulin Nation for tens of thousands of years. So I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri and Bunurong elders of the past and present, to those who yet to be, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people who may be joining us here today from within Australia and beyond our shores. And I also wish everyone a happy NAIDOC week. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. While I'm talking, I'm going to share some installation images of two Gordon Bennett exhibitions, Mirror Line, which was held in the physics annex of the Ian Potter Gallery at the University of Melbourne in 1993, where Gordon used Groote Eylandt barks and works from the colonial holdings of the university's Grimwade collection in the installation. And this exhibition had a huge impact on me while I was studying at the University of Melbourne. And also, just so that you don't have to stare at my face while I'm speaking, share images of the retrospective that I had the privilege of curating at the NGV in 2006. Bear with me, we'll just see if this will appropriately work. No, it's not behaving now, bear with me. There we go. No? I just updated my system last night and it's not doing what I want. We'll try one more time and then if not, we'll leave it. This is where I'll use all my time to get the screen to work. No, it's not going to work. Let's forget that, folks. I apologise. I'll be reading today from the Manifesto, which first appeared in the 1996 book Gordon Bennett by Ian McLean and Gordon. This seminal essay is broken into different sections comprising the prologue, a personal history, the voyage out, the voyage in, and the epilogue. And I'll read a selection of excerpts from across the piece, focusing by way of introduction to what will be covered by the panel today, and shared from Gordon's writing, focusing in this section on a more personal biographical perspective. So firstly from the prologue, which appears on page 37 of Gordon Bennett's selected writings, and Gordon writes, "There came a time in my life when I became aware of my Aboriginal heritage. This may seem of little consequence, but when the weight of European representations of Aboriginal people as the quintessential primitive other is realised and understood within discourses of self and other as a level of abstraction with which we become familiar in our books and our classrooms, but which we rarely feel on our pulses, then you may understand why such an awareness was problematic for my sense of identity. The conceptual gap between myself and other collapsed, and I was thrown into turmoil. It is the collapse of the conceptual gap between the binary oppositions of self and other, civilised savage, sophisticated primitive, or perhaps more appropriately, its gradual disintegration and my process of integration that forms the substratum of my life and work. Consequently, I'm interested in psychoanalysis, particularly in the kind of radical analysis that interprets the so-called norms of society as repressive illusions and which regards analysis as a preparation for the analysand to get outside them once and for all. The aim of radical analysis is to foster the strength, to deal with the effects of such a break, rejection, hostility, fear and anxiety, and to live creatively with the diversity of meanings outside set judgments. And then from the section entitled The Voyage In, Gordon writes, Aboriginality is no life raft for me. It remains too problematical to identify with and leave unquestioned. After all, it was this very same problem of identification that drove me to bail out of my previous life in the first place. And I wasn't about to provide a foil for anyone to affirm that colonial identity I myself had rejected. I decided that I was in a very interesting position. My mind and body had been effectively colonised by Western culture, and yet my Aboriginality, which had been historically, socially and personally repressed, was still part of me, and I was obtaining the tools and the language to explore it on my own terms. In a conceptual sense, I was liberated from the binary prison of self and other. The wall had disintegrated, but where was I? In a real sense, I was still living in the suburbs and in a world where there was very real demands to be either one thing or the other. There was still no space for me to simply be. I decided that I would attempt to create a space by adopting a strategy of intervention and disturbance in the field of representation through my art. I was acutely aware of the racist stereotypes and the power-knowledge relationship that govern the historical representation of Aborigines within contemporary Australian culture. Cultural identities are the points of identification or suture, which are made within the discourses of history and culture, not an essence, but a positioning. Identities come from somewhere, have histories, and like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. Far from being externally fixed in some essentialised past, they are subject to the continuous play of history, culture, and power. Far from being grounded in a mere recovery of the past, which is waiting to be found, and which, when found, will secure our sense of selves into eternity, identities are the names we give to the different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. And finally, from the epilogue, which appears on page 53 of the new publication, I have never started out to do a political painting. If my work is political then, that is because of the politics of my position and the cultural climate in which I live and work. I didn't go to art college to graduate as an inverted commas, Aboriginal artist. I did want to explore Aboriginality, however, and it is the subject of my work as much as colonialism and the narratives and language that frame it, and the language that has consistently framed me. Acutely aware of the frame, I graduated as a straight honours student of fine art to find myself positioned and contained by the language of primitivism as an urban Aboriginal artist. While some people may argue this has been a quick road to success and that my work is authorised by my Aboriginality, I maintain that I don't have to be an Aborigine to do what I do, and that quick success is not an inherent attribute of an Aboriginal heritage, as history has shown, nor is it that unusual for college graduates who have something relevant to say. Being aware of my positioning, I've often used it as a strategic logocenter in response to a society that seems to transfix me with the patronising and conceited gaze of those who only seem able to think in terms of the conventional and common sense binaries of the noble or ennoble savage. Thus smothered, I embarked on a critique of the foundations of this and other stereotypes of Aboriginalism. I am very aware of the boundaries of critical containment within the parameters of urban Aboriginal art, and have so far worked within these boundaries to try and broaden, extend, and subvert them. The reality is, however, that I never really had much choice, and I've been faced with my work not entering some collections on the ground of it being not Aboriginal enough, to being asked to sell my work through stalls at cultural festivals, to being described, along with two other artists, in the catalogue of a recent Australian exhibition in New York as urban Aboriginal artists whose most peculiar Australian characteristic of their work is the lesson they carry from their bush-dwelling cousins. Such is the politics of my position. It's a tough position to carry on from. I mean, interestingly, I think Gordon goes on to discuss in this really extraordinary essay that still holds its power after all of these years, his avoidance of any categorisation of his work as an Aboriginal artist and producing Aboriginal art, as we saw in the passage above, and his resistance to being seen as a spokesperson, in inverted commas, for his people. And this is where I'd really like to start my own reflections. As many of you, or some of you may know, I had the extraordinary privilege of curating the 2007 retrospective of Gordon Bennett's work at the National Gallery of Victoria. And interestingly, I came to work on that show as the curator around 2006 through one of Gordon's museological interventions that was and still is fundamentally grounded in this disavowal of categorisation. The exhibition had actually been proposed by Judith Ryan, who is the Senior Curator of Indigenous Art, a dear friend and colleague, and initial discussions had been underway with the exhibition. Gordon's work within the NGV's collections had been acquired through the Indigenous Art Department at that stage. But for the exhibition to proceed, Gordon had decided that, and rightly so, that he wanted it to be curated within the context of contemporary art. And so it was effectively, and very happily, I must say, handed to me. But of course, it wasn't just about who did the exhibition, but about how those works were collected. And this entailed, it was the transfer of works from the Indigenous Art Department to contemporary art or Australian art. And these things, for those of us who have worked in institutions, we know that they're not straightforward. It's not so simple as ticking a box on a database. I really wish it was. But I think what was fascinating about this aspect of Gordon's practice, and it is part of his practice, there was a knowing undoing within this of the colonial systems and motivations at the heart of Western museology. And what makes the museum, which is really, at that scale, they're slow and largely resistant to change despite best intentions. It was really getting to the heart of what makes museums work. The opening of the Quag Goma exhibition, which unfortunately, given I'm just in sort of post-lockdown Melbourne, I haven't yet seen, and the launch of this important publication has really made me reflect on how the control, and it's not a word I like, I just couldn't think of another one, or perhaps management of Gordon's work and career was and remains central to the project itself, and continues to be an act of resistance driven by the hope and indeed expectation of societal change, an acceptance and embrace of difference, and of greater understanding of the traumatic legacy and ongoing impacts of colonisation. Gordon's act of non-performance, which ran from 1992 until his untimely death in 2014, where he refused to speak about or publish on his work, with the exception of the interview he did with Bill Wright at the time of the 2007 exhibition, and which is reproduced in the catalogue. And I reflect on that now and think, wow, how extraordinarily lucky were we to have that moment. This act of non-performance was both a form of resistance and self-protection, just as the creation of John Citizen and the later abstract stripe paintings, which started in 2003, were a means of escape, a creative place of less expectation and pressure, and a place of freedom. But of course, Gordon also realised that this was idealistic and nigh impossible, because John Citizen goes on to build a pretty substantial CV of his own in his own right, but he's still Gordon Bennett, and that's widely known. And as he discussed with Bill in the interview in the publication, the abstract paintings themselves also continue to be interpreted through the lens of race and in terms of his known biography and the concerns of him as the artist who created them. However, beyond that, what I've also realised on reflection and with some distance is that Gordon's non-performance extended in a very particular way at the stage of his career that I was working with him to exhibition making, turning the expectations of the curator as collaborator, curatorial practice, and the institution on its head. Interestingly, and I'll just a quick reflection that may, for some of the curators and artists listening today, sort of show how this started. The show, when I worked on it, this is just a personal position, it would be different for others, certainly. But it wasn't about access to the artists and that sort of, notion of extended time in the studio. I was working from Melbourne, Gordon is in Brisbane, so there were certain limitations there. But for example, my first visit to Samford to meet with Gordon and Leanne to discuss the exhibition, and I'm sure Leanne remembers this. Gordon played video games for the entire day, and I sat in the kitchen and talked to Leanne and had a very beautiful lunch, and then got in a cab and went back to Melbourne. So it was challenging, but on reflection, I understand there were reasons for this, and I deeply respect them and have come to see them as part of that broader practice. As the show progressed, we worked closely on the selection of works and eventually on the exhibition layout, but from memory, there was very little dialogue about the works themselves. As I said, distance was a factor in this, and time. We had 18 months tops, probably less than that, to do the entire show and publication. But it was actually a resistance to perform for the exhibition, to give himself over to it and be consumed by it. And also, whether consciously or not, I think this was about subverting the power of the curator and the museum, and a way of reinforcing again, whether consciously or not, that these works, while full of self-portraits, are not self-portraiture, they're constructions. And we see this increasingly, of course, in the complexity and overlapping of their surfaces and imagery. If we think of the home decor series as just one example. But I think for Gordon, access to the artist, he wanted to sort of convey very clearly that access to the artist shouldn't and wouldn't provide the answers. It's about the work. And in my experience, the curator and indeed the audience were expected to do the work. I also think this, of course, for Gordon particularly and his practice, this is why it was very important for him across his career to have trusted long-term interlocutors and collaborators like Ian McLean and Simon Wright, because of course you don't have to effectively start the conversation at the beginning with a retelling. In terms of the way both the curator and importantly the institution worked, it also meant that the balance of power, which wasn't and isn't about power per se, but about managing the interpretation or narrative around the works, lies in the artist's hands. A simple but very effective practice, like not releasing images and copyright until the text is approved, and I know that this still continues with the estate in Leanne Bennett's very competent hands, can really mess with institutional workflows and timelines. And I can say from personal reflection, when you're working on very large bodies of work, create real anxiety. But it also ensures that the artist can be certain about the framing of the communication around his work, which for Gordon in regards to audiences was so important in terms of education, shifting perceptions and prejudices, and his very heartfelt desire for his work to drive change. I think it's also ultimately why he couldn't escape figuration, and that his post-colonial project, he couldn't escape figuration and that post-colonial project because, of course, the job wasn't and still isn't done. I also think it's interesting, and we certainly see this in his 1995 letter to Sue Smith, who was the art critic of the Courier Mail at the time, and in his letter of a year earlier on a different matter to John Laws, that his concern wasn't about a bad review, but about misunderstanding and about the role and power of language, the way in which it can perpetuate racism, and the responsibility of those who are charged with it as a form of mass communication. Ultimately, given the combination and coming together of different works through the curatorial process, for Gordon, exhibition making was a meta version of the sampling, circulation and reuse of the different visual languages and art world personalities, Van Gogh, Lichtenstein, Pollock, Preston, Mondrian, Basquiat, that we see in the works themselves, and was subject to the same considered and careful sense of construction and framing. After Gordon moved quickly from the expressionistic works that launched his career, the act of painting was one in which everything was pre-planned. His works, which are already a labour-intensive exercise and multi-layered physically, became increasingly entangled and complex in their use of imagery over time, particularly as his proficiency with software packages like Photoshop improved. And as a result, the act of painting became about executing a preconceived plan and a conceptual exercise. And I have come to realise on reflection that his work with exhibitions was absolutely no different. And it's now my delight to pass over to Judy Watson. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So I would also like to acknowledge Aboriginal owners of country. That's all of Australia, really. And as NAIDOC says, always was, always will be. This is Aboriginal land. We are all standing on, sitting on, and participating in this Zoom production on. So I'm a Wanyi Aboriginal woman from northwest Queensland, but I grew up in Brisbane. And at a later date, I actually came from Mundubra, where I was born. My father was in the post office, which is not very far from Gordon's birthplace of Monto. And I was born on the same birthday, which Leanne and I discovered further down the track, but a few years later. I first met Gordon Bennett in 1989 when I had an artist in residency at Griffith University in Brisbane. I saw some of his work at Bellis Gallery, which was amazing. I remember Peter Bellis showing me through some of the work. I saw his work, The Outsider, when it was opened at UQ Art Museum. And I remember going in with Gordon and Leanne and Nancy Underhill being there. And I remember his installation at the Institute of Modern Art, which had the photographs of both his mother and his father and the chessboard pieces. Gordon had come out to see me at Griffith University to ask if I would write something about his work, but I wasn't confident writing about other people's art. At that stage, I thought I should stay as a practitioner and didn't go ahead, although I did start doing that later on. I thought Gordon's work was amazing and felt like he was a fellow traveller. We joked about being secret agents because some people wouldn't recognise us as being Aboriginal and would say the most derogatory and racist comments about Aboriginal people in our presence. So this was our burden to bear, but it was also our secret weapon. And I think you can really see in Gordon's work that he really turned that and ricocheted it back to those people who had dumped that poison upon him and upon us. During a public forum in Brisbane, a couple of artists called out from the audience that Gordon Bennett was making work that appropriated artists' works. And it was such a line of attack, and I thought it was unfair and cowardly that Gordon wasn't there to defend himself from these accusations of art transgressions among a big room full of people who didn't know him. I phoned Gordon and suggested he might want to come into the Cultural Centre and put his perspective across. Gordon arrived, and I remember introducing him to people like Gary Lee, who had just given a brilliant paper on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and many other people. And years later, I asked Gordon if anything got resolved, but nobody discussed the issues with him face to face. In 1992, I stayed with Gordon and Leanne in France at Auvilliers during his Moët and Chandon Fellowship residency. And I saw the really interesting and exploratory works he was making in response to his experiences being over there and the artist he was exposed to. It was great to talk about what they had seen and the places they had visited. We walked around the Moët estate, and I I have to find a photo I took of Gordon because we joked he looked like a werewolf over there. And swimming at the pool in Rams with Gordon and Leanne, it felt strange to be Australian among a sea of French. I remember someone commenting on our Australian crawl. We wanted to swim and they were all standing around in the pool, so we couldn't get past. And I remember their exciting news that Leanne was pregnant. I couldn't believe how efficient Leanne was, sticking all their travel receipts into a book and noting down their details. She looked after their household and was highly organised so Gordon could make his work, absolutely supportive of his vision. But like Kelly said, I remember, you know, Gordon would then go up to his room, and Leanne and I would stay talking in the kitchen. Years later, at a Moet opening in Brisbane, I was introduced to Gordon's mother, Grace, who I introduced to my Aboriginal grandmother, Grace, and they sat together at the launch of that exhibition. And later that year, Gordon, Leanne and I met up in New York for the Antipodes and Currents exhibition, the one that Gordon's probably referring to when he said there were two other artists in the show apart from himself. That would have been Tracy Moffat, myself and Gordon, and we were known as the Urban Aboriginal Artists. The dinner in the foyer of the Frank Lloyd Wright Guggenheim Museum was surreal. And Felicia Khan, a fellow artist in the show, took pics of Gordon and I clowning around. My family and I visited Gordon and Leanne at the beautiful place at Sanford, and it was great to see his studio set up and all the work they had done at their property. And just talking about painting and ideas. And Gordon asked me once how I could keep on going making artwork. I think I must have been exhausted after his recent output. We would catch up sometimes at Bellis and later Milani Gallery, and Gordon and Leanne came to our place for dinner with my parents. It was, sometimes I felt he was a lone ranger. You know, he had just this very, very different vision, and people who I met overseas who knew him always spoke highly of him. His work was trailblazing and so important. And I hope that more and more people in Australia and around the world get to know his artwork and his ideas. At one stage, I was doing some workshops out at Cherbourg with local artists, where his brother Bradley was working at the time. And I asked Gordon if he would like to go out there. His mother Grace had a connection to this place, but it wasn't something he was comfortable with. Those questions of categories come up all the time. And I remember, you know, there was always this perception of who we were as Aboriginal people. You know, if we weren't living in a remote community or weren't from a, you know, didn't have our language or something else. I remember Cliff Wattigo back in about 89 at Griffith University saying, "I'm not a mission black, but a housing commission black." And I really identified with that, coming from Acacia Ridge and sort of having that sort of suburban education, and also stratification in terms of where you were seen, depending upon what suburb you went to, what school you went to, what level of society you went to, you were slotted in and you were looked down on, most of all if you were Aboriginal. An auction house once asked me which category my work should be in, contemporary or Aboriginal. And I said both, you know, that was for them to deal with. So I agree with Gordon and many other artists that these definitions are up to other people to deal with. You know, I sometimes joke that, you know, the Blues Brothers were told there were only two types of music, country and Western. And for me, I am both country and Western. I come from country, specific country, 1 year country in Northwest Queensland, but I've had a Western education, and I've gone on to have a Western education through art school and to work in those institutions, those universities as well. I was running a lithography workshop in Townsville at Umbrella Studio when Josh Milani rang me to tell me that Gordon had died. And I felt like I'd been hit in the gut. It was such a terrible loss to Leanne and Caitlin and to all of us. He shone the light on our Black history and was roads ahead of anyone else. Gordon had an incisive intellect, wit and vision that powered through the sludge of colonisation in this country. His work remains a testament to his strength of conviction and knack of reflecting the past onto our present and our inadequacies onto ourselves. So to begin with, I would like to read from page 52, Gordon Bennett's book. And, no, sorry, start off with page 42. So this is where Gordon's talking about Adrian Piper. And I had seen Adrian Piper's work in San Francisco in '92, the cornered work, and just felt that was so powerful, such a great piece of work that pulled the audience in and then suddenly confronted them with the racism that they were projecting onto her. And I think that's when I feel that work is the work that I would, love to make most of all, seducing people and then suddenly hitting it back to them. So Gordon says, my experience was similar to that of Adrian Piper, a conceptual artist of African American descent with a fair complexion, who writes, blacks like me are unwilling observers of the forms racism takes when racists believe there are no blacks present. Sometimes it hurts so much we want to disappear, disembody, disinherit ourselves from our blackness, our experiences. In this society, manifest themselves in neurosis, demoralisation, anger, and in art. And later on, I met Adrian Piper along with Brenda Croft and Hetty Perkins, and we talked about many of these issues, and she went to work with Brenda Croft on an amazing piece for the Biennale of Sydney. The early 80s, back to Gordon Bennett, were a time of great personal growth for me, a time of learning to believe in myself as a person, and a time of reconstructing a self-image distorted by the mirror of racist beliefs. I understood that need to stop denying and repressing my Aboriginal heritage. I found the courage and self-confidence to quit my safe, secure job and go to art college. Yeah, so I had fairly similar but different experiences. I had, back in the late 70s, I had been making work talking about my Aboriginality, talking about massacres, talking about cultural experience and dispossession that was experienced by Native American, and it really came from readings that I was doing at the time, studying literature and looking at American literature and thinking I wanted to look at my own culture and my own heritage, and I couldn't find a lot, so I was discovering as I went along. Then I went to arts, worked in a time at a factory in Salisbury to save money to go down there, and really experienced, I'd just say, sort of the way that everybody thinks and feels, who's not in and hasn't had a possibility to become educated and become aware of other ways of being in the world. Went down to Tasmania and was asked by the printmaking lecturer down there, well, what sort of work had I been doing? Showed him the work, started making work, which was an image, two-plate image showing a typical Aboriginal image in the background, and then it was going to have a sort of holograph etching across it of me as a so-called urban Aboriginal woman with this work on as a wallpaper, or sort of, on the wall. And I was then told by this person, but you can't make that work, you're not Aboriginal. And I said, well, how do you know I can't? Or how do you know I'm not? And he said, well, you're not, are you? And I thought, well, I don't have my family with me, sort of on my sleeve, as my mother called it, to be able to tell him I couldn't. So I didn't talk to him for the rest of the semester, ended up failing, and just decided to sort of just make work that would get me through and not really make work about Aboriginality or family or things like that until I came back to Queensland, where I felt like I had more connection with my family. So about 15 years after that happened, I was at Antipodes and Currents, the exhibition, and this person was there, sat next to my sister, and asked how my grandmother was, who I'd spoken about. And my sister said, oh yeah, she's fine. And then he apologised to me. So I think that that is not an uncommon story for many Aboriginal people studying or sort of in work situations. But it cuts deep. Now I'm going on to page 52. Many people, this is Gordon Bennett again, many people it seems have come to regard any expression of an Aboriginal point of view or experience as some kind of guilt trip designed to make non-Aboriginal people feel bad about Australia's past. In fact, some politicians dismiss such expressions as part of a guilt industry. I feel saddened and not a little disgusted that these people expect Aboriginal people to keep quiet about our history, quiet about our experiences, and to those who dare break the white blanket of silence are directed the emotional accusations of moralising, as if morality is a dirty word and has no place in art. The history of Western art and its relationship to the church and so-called high culture should indicate, even to the most ignorant, that morality has always been a driving force in art, particularly in colonial art, and it is even more evident in the representation of Aboriginal peoples. Certainly white Australia has proven itself to be a master of moralising. My own experience confirms that much. It seems that any expression of an Aboriginal perspective or critique of colonial narratives and myths, both romantic and scientific, is derided by some people as the guilt industry. Alternative views are also dismissed by labelling them in a derogatory manner as politically correct, even to the extent of the Queensland government. In 1993, pulping Year 5 primary school readers that dare to deviate or offer alternatives from the conventional line and myth of peaceful settlement. The shrill cries of such derision always seem to drown out the real issues in any form of rational discussion and examination of them. Aboriginal people go to school too. Brave indeed is an Aboriginal child who stands up in class and gives confidently their point of view from a place of honour in the white man's story of the past, when the very instruments of their education marginalise not only their point of view, but their ancestors and even their own experience. I guess pulping books that dare to tamper with white myths is far more subtle and at least more ecologically sound than burning them. And I know that one of my cousins in Mount Isa had that same experience in primary school, standing up and telling the teacher and the rest of the class, my parents are Aboriginal, you know, and they are not the stereotypes that you are teaching us. And that was so incredibly brave, especially in Mount Isa. And then I have one more piece that I want to read from, which is page 88, Letters from Home Sweet Home series, 1993 to 94. Shadow Monsters from the Id, 27 of the 4th, 94. Please excuse me, I don't mean to offend. I was just remembering the many years I've spent living in the suburbs, all the parties I've been to, the barbecues, the discos and pubs, etc. I've seen a lot of violence in my time, people drinking and becoming aggressive, punching out walls or each other. I've heard about the rapes, the murders, the robberies and general assaults. I've been the victim of violent assaults myself several times. In fact, I learnt to feel unsafe in crowds of people, and sometimes I'm still unable to enter a crowded room. I feel like an outsider sometimes, and even a victim. I see and hear all this violence in this society, but I see and hear another kind of violence that is just as prevalent. It's the psychic violence directed towards Aboriginal people, and it disables and scars just as much as the physical violence that is perpetrated daily in the general non-Aboriginal community. I remember the abuse I've heard about us being drunks, violent, unable to look after our children, immoral, lazy bloodsters who can't seem to look after themselves, and more, too much more. It seems to me that Aboriginal people are the dumping ground for all those human traits the non-Aboriginal community can't seem to accept in their own behaviour. All that is savage, uncivilised and even primitive by their own definition in their own behaviour, as can be seen in the daily newspapers and on TV. It's like all that is repressed, pushed away to be unconscionably dumped onto Aborigines as the black shadow monsters from the Id. Gordon Bennett, 4th at 4th PM. Okay, And now it gives me great pleasure to pass on to Stephen Gilchrist.
Thank you so much, Judy and Kelly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people on whose land I'm now on. This place was named for the Gadigal, because of the Gadigal and by the Gadigal. I'd like to read a passage from an exhibition catalogue. The exhibition was Aratjara, Art of the First Australians, Traditional and Contemporary Works by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Artists. And as someone who's written for international audiences, I've often looked to others to think about how to position Indigenous art as international art, as contemporary art, as Indigenous art, and how do we tell the story of this place now termed Australia. I guess I'm broadly interested in the politics of refusal and unbelonging, and reading the critical writings of Gordon Bennett has really helped me develop some of these ideas. So the essay is called Aesthetics and Iconography, an Artist Approach. And by way of introduction, Aratjara was a large touring exhibition that opened at the Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf in 1993. So it's curated by Swiss artists Bernard Luthi, but with the active involvement of people like John Mundine, Gary Lee, Gary Foley, Lynn Onus. And the show travelled to the Hayward Gallery in London and finally opened at the Louisiana Museum in Humlebæk, Denmark. And the exhibition had a huge audience. It was seen by over 250,000 people. The catalogue was sold out. And it really revealed this commitment to troubling the limits of critical language and exceeding the category of Indigenous art as it was largely understood at the time. And one of the significant things about the exhibition is that it was committed to showing artists outside of the West and outside of ethnographic museums where the majority of Indigenous collections of art were held. So this essay really grapples with institutional shape-shifting, definitional regimes of art and aesthetics, iconography, critical vocabularies, and the politics of identity. And you know, he writes, because we are all implicated into this same system, it demands a personal reckoning as well as a national reckoning. So it's a great essay, and I'd like to read two sections, please. The system of visual signs that constitute the iconography of a Western art tradition of representation can therefore be determined as functioning in a similar way to a language in its structuring of a visual worldview. Implicit in the term worldview, it should be noted, is the notion of ideology. Ideology, when understood as a body of ideas about the world that reflects the beliefs and interests of a cultural group or society, is reflected, maintained, and reinforced by visual representation. Representation is in fact a powerful social instrument for the creation and maintenance of the world in which we live. This applies equally to Australian Aboriginal societies as it does to any Western society. Indeed, it applies to all societies. My sense of aesthetics is that which was nurtured and developed within the structures of a Eurocentric worldview. I was socialized into a Euro-Australian system of representation, which included an art school education. However, my approach to aesthetics is to seek to extend my concepts of it, and by extension, to expand my concepts of representation. There came a time in my life, in my sense of self and identity, my Aboriginal heritage. This may seem of no consequence to the subject at hand, but when the weight of European representation of Aboriginal people as the quintessential primitive other is realised, and perhaps understood at a certain level of abstraction, involving a discourse of self and other with which we become familiar in our books and our classrooms, by which we rarely feel on our pulses, then it may be seen that such an awareness was problematic for my sense of identity. The conceptual gap between self and other collapsed, and I was thrown into turmoil. Michel Foucault talked of a concept of critical community, where something intolerable is found in a system of identification. It is characterized as a refusal to participate in this system of recognition, and thus problematizes identity and makes of subjectivity an open and endless question, at once individual and collective. In Australia, the dominant system of identification begins with the discovery of the continent by Captain James Cook. it continues with the exploration and pioneer settlement of a seemingly empty land. Today, the pioneer spirit and rugged outback image are still evoked as the identity all Australians share, even though the majority of Australians live in cities, in one of the most urbanised countries in the world. I do not share this identity as I once did. My approach to the iconography that sustains it is deconstructive. This is not to deny the personal hardships of those European individuals who have been romanticised, indeed mythologised as heroes of Australian history, but to expose other histories, other versions of settlement, of exploration and exploitation, and other systems of identification. I wish to reinstate a sense of Aboriginal people within the culturally dominant system of representation as human beings rather than as visual sign that signifies the primitive, the noble savage, or some other European construct associated with black skin. I'm just skipping 2 paragraphs. When James Cook first set eyes on Australian shores, he already had a notion of the primitive. It was just a matter of recognition, to position Aborigines as such in his mind. Cook also had his notions of culture and of landscape as property. It was only a matter of recognition to see that Aborigines had neither. And so it was that Australia was declared terra nullius, or empty land, and became the property of the English crown. Aboriginal cultures are among the world's most ancient and impressive cultures, incorporating the subtle, complex, and rich ways of life. Aboriginal cave art predates the famous cave paintings of bulls, horses, and deer in Lascaux in the French Dordogne by nearly 20,000 years. Evidence suggests that Aborigines developed religious beliefs and burial practices more than 10,000 years before similar ideas began to emerge along the Nile and in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta. This, of course, points to a long tradition of cultural and self-representation through language and through art in the form of ceremonial dance and painting. As Kelly mentioned, for various institutions, I was also working with Kelly at the NGV. For various institutional and organisational reasons, I didn't really work with Gordon's art as a curator. But I do remember my very first job interview in the arts, and I had to describe an artist who inspired me, and I spoke about Gordon's work. I do remember the first time I encountered his work, and it was The Outsider that we've heard from a few people. This stylized representation of Vincent van Gogh's bedroom colliding with starry night, and this decapitated figure of an Aboriginal man who is basically becoming dematerialized, dismembered, vaporized. And it was this small black and white reproduction in Wally Caruana's Aboriginal art publication. And I just remember feeling like it hit me in the stomach. And it just reminded me of all those times and all those spaces and all those interactions that you're made to feel like you don't belong. And, you know, as a teenager at the time, so you're going through a lot. But, you know, I think my anxiety was never about being Aboriginal. My anxiety was about being hated. And you learn this, you know, so quickly as an Aboriginal person. And you get used to not seeing yourself in these versions of Australianness, of art history. And I think, you know, as a young person, as a young art curator then, I never doubted that Indigenous art deserved to be in these spaces, in these art galleries, in social history museums. But I never really fully appreciated the tension of what that belonging involves, you know, given the existing and historical structures of these institutions. Many of these institutions never imagined Indigenous people in them. And sometimes our presence can feel not just an accommodation, but a threat. I think we forget how radical it was for Indigenous art to be in institutions. I think, you know, in the 1990s, many artists like Judy were thinking about, well, how do we survive empire? You know, particularly in 1988 when The Outsiders was created. And I guess this also made me think about, well, how do we also survive art history? And I think this question still resonates for me and made me think, and, you know, how do I create better spaces of unbelonging? How do I create, you know, an art history that's more attuned to Indigenous values? The canon does the work that I do. The canon makes the work that I do a little difficult, but also, in a way, it makes the interventionist and deconstructivist and kind of revisionist work that we do kind of more legible. I've never really thought it's my occupational responsibility to kind of undo the canon or make the canon better, but to question the canon and to question canonicity and say that the canon's not correct for all of us. And insist on what Gordon is trying to say, that there are different modes of value, and these might be new modes, but they could be customary modes of value as well. He says that language is a form of recognition. Language is the way that we recognize these values. You know, and how do we use the same instrument that has dispossessed us to kind of liberate us? Can this contradiction ever be resolved? You know, what would a new critical language sound like, and who would be its speaker? And he writes that Indigenous cultures are already self-possessed of their own value, their own distinctive value. They don't need to be reified through these Western modes of value and recognition. He talks about the dominance of Captain James Cook, and in this anniversary year, I think it's been interesting to see how this system of identification, as Bennett puts it, is still really dominant. But I do think it has been diminished, you know, if only slightly. But I think the questioning around this dominance actually exposes the historical and existing monopolizations of power that uphold this dominance. And I'm thinking particularly about those images that we saw about the police protecting the Captain Cook statue in Sydney's Hyde Park. And in this essay, he deals with iconography, he deals with signifiers, and Cook is certainly one of these kind of important icons. But he wants us to move beyond this temporalized moment of invasion. Colonization isn't this singular event of mythologizing encounter, but this process of ideological control. You know, it embeds itself in our institutions, social structures, reductive national identities, and insinuates itself into our individual psyches. And recognizing only the consequences of that moment of history subordinates all that came before it. And this is, you know, a kind of an act of violence. And this signifier is also in the identities that he's talking about. And, you know, I think I've often framed his strategic maneuvering in these really kind of absolute terms. You know, did it challenge the art world? Did it surrender to the art world? And I think his politics of refusal really allows for this way to exceed the limits of these representational regimes, to define and confine us. You know, I do think that the art world has had to change, you know, and that now, you know, this difference is understood in, you know, different kinds of ways. You know, the Aboriginality that he sketches out in this essay is really an identity of crisis. It's created by non-Aboriginal people and projected onto Aboriginal people. And it's this anxiety of being constructed that he observes, that, and then many of the other authors in the Aratjara catalogue were also rejecting. And, you know, he's not rejecting his indigeneity, but to kind of reject the narrowing criticality that accompanies this Indigenous self-identification. And he took away this determinative power. And this legacy continues, I think, in the very Constitution in a much more expansive and nuanced contemporary art world. There's one last passage that I wanted to read, which has helped, keep the faith, I guess. It's a short excerpt. I'm trying to paint the one painting that will change the world, before which even the most narrow-minded and rabid racists will fall to their knees in profound awareness and spiritual openness, thus recognizing their own stupidity, at once transcending it to become. Of course, this is in itself stupid, and I am a fool, but I think to myself, what have I got to lose by trying? I really like this quote, and I guess many of us have grappled with the utility of art. Do we necessarily over-exaggerate the transformational potential of art? You know, what are the expectations of Indigenous artists who are often unfairly tasked with remediating art museums, decolonizing art history, reconciling the nation, you know, it's a tough gig. And, you know, non-art world, people often taught artists with the question, with all the pain and suffering and injustice in the world, you know, how can you make art? Art is so insignificant, is their catch cry. And I see in Bennett's thought process this really courageous act of, if not slightly hesitant, commitment to saying, well, with all the pain and suffering and injustice in the world, how can you not make art? And there's something so powerful about this ambition to do all that you can in the world and use all that you have been given, and to stand up and speak to those who want to destroy you. And it might be foolish and scary and exhausting, and it might not change the world, but we might change something and someone. Thank you. Tim, would you like to continue now?
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thank you to Judy and to Kelly as well for their thoughts. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country from which I'm speaking today, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as recognising that sovereignty has never been ceded in this land. Always was, always will be. Thank you, Mark, for chairing today's discussion, and to Power Publications, particularly as well to Marnie Williams, and also to Nicholas Krogan. I'd also like to, as I said, thanks Kelly, Judy and Stephen for their selections and your insights. It's been fantastic. And I'd also like to quickly just express my gratitude to Angela Goddard, Leanne Bennett, Caitlin Bennett, and Josh Malani for all of their support in the development of this publication. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint, so just give me a moment. I've compiled today some thoughts on Gordon and how my relationship with him may differ somewhat from the other attendees today, as my relationship with Gordon is one that's been navigated solely through his art and his archive rather than him as an individual. So I'm going to reflect first in my words, and then we'll finish with Gordon's words so as to leave you with those. The images that you see playing on the screen are drawn from his writing in his notebooks, which are situated within his archive, details of works that also informed our publication, and images of Gordon's studio space, which should be coming up after this image. I met Gordon only once. I'd begun working for Josh Malani as the gallery manager of Malani Gallery in late 2013. Gordon came into the gallery to have a meeting with a visiting curator, and Leanne was there as well, supporting him in that. Yeah, and I guess for me, the person that I met that day was very much preceded by his art. I saw Gordon's 1987 painting Outsider, which Stephen mentioned earlier, in high school, reproduced within a textbook. A place Gordon often stated he hoped his works would eventually live on within, disrupting and troubling the dominant lies told about Australia's history. That painting threw me, it rattled me. And at the time I photocopied it and I pasted it in my art journal. And I expected the person who painted it to be similarly brazen. At that stage, as a curious little side note, I did not actually know that Tony Albert had sat within that very same art department at the Gap State High School a few years prior to me. In person, Gordon was tall, nearly my height, and shy, softly spoken. That day when I met him, the idea I had of the artist and the man himself did not quite align, but I had no real time to reconcile this. At some point around the 3rd of June 2014, I received a call from Josh from the airplane somewhere in international airspace. I still don't know how he got reception, calling to tell me the quite tragic news that Gordon had passed away. My experience thus of Gordon is one structured very much posthumously. A week or two after that call, Josh entrusted me with working with Leanne to document Gordon's studio. I spent 18 months, one day a week, looking through artworks and files with Leanne. The image that you saw just prior to this one is Gordon's desk, with his computer and scanner, surrounded by his considerable library. I recognized that I was entering into a very sensitive place, a creative space not many had seen, though also a space of very recent heartbreaking loss. At the conclusion of this process, and with Leanne's blessing, I started writing a thesis. And it was in these resources, in his archive and his studio, that a view on Gordon grew, though my understanding of him only grew more nuanced rather than more resolved, a distinction which I feel Gordon would appreciate. For his pages, a selection of which is reproduced in this publication that you can see on screen, was a Gordon that was himself uncertain, unresolved, and grew to celebrate these very qualities as an articulation of being, questioning sort of the structures of identity and of language. This was a way for him to extend beyond and between the boundaries that attempted to restrict us in space of nets and grids that also try to bind. One quality that emerged from Gordon's writing and that Angela and I as editors felt became central part of the framing of this work is the importance of silence, withdrawal, refusal as creative acts for Gordon. These were places of freedom. At points in his career, Gordon stopped speaking publicly or stopped publishing his writing, though he always continued making. It is easy to think of these periods of silence as being periods of inactivity, but the product of not speaking or not writing is not absence. As John Cage evidenced, silence is impossible. Like Cage, Gordon's silence was purposeful. Opportunities for his arts audience and broader society to reflect on what it meant to not speak, to not write. Such action also reasserts focus on other means of communication, in this case, on Gordon's art. It seems perhaps an odd thing to be emphasizing in the light of a big publication of nearly 40 texts, but a sub-narrative of this publication tells of Gordon's growing confidence in speaking through his art, of refining his preferred medium of communication to a point where it could more fully encompass the positions he found largely incompatible with the structure of language. As editors, Angela and I felt an important question was how to represent these moments of withdrawal, of refusal. Thus, why it was crucial to also include reproductions of key works within this book, so that his art remained constant. Gordon is an artist who's certainly been discussed widely, written about frequently, yet it remains curious how often his voice slips out of those narratives, how it's not represented or championed. This book was an opportunity to celebrate this written voice, and it occupies many formats: scholarly debate, political argument, personal reflection. I want to conclude today's readings with some selected excerpts from a letter Gordon sent to the Brisbane artist Eugene Carchesio in 1992. And Eugene had become a close collaborator of Gordon's from around 1990. 92 was a really important year for Gordon. He was in Haute-Villers in France, as Judy mentioned, as part of the Moet Fellowship residency. And at that time, there was a lot of media attention. Gordon found that very kind of restricting. And he kind of felt like he was repeating himself constantly, and that despite his repetitions, he was continuing to be misrepresented. This previously unseen letter evidences Bennett's expanding points of artistic inspiration, and interestingly for my broader research, connections with the legacies of conceptualism. Two artists revealed more fully in this publication for the first time as inspirations are the first generation American conceptualist Adrian Piper, who Judy mentioned earlier, and the Belgian poet-artist Marcel Brotherse, two artists who also value and valued withdrawal from production as a creative and conceptual act. Brotherse's 1968 work, Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, or what's simply known as his museum, saw the artist withdraw from typical artistic production to start a museum of his own as a means of commenting on the role of art and museums within society. And I think there's some intriguing parallels here as well to be made with Gordon's own forms of institutional critique. If we can think about his 2008 proposal for the Biennale of Sydney, for example. Informed by Carchesio's own conception of a museum of silence, Gordon proposes, ahead of his return to Australia in mid-1992, a collaboration in which we can hear the beginnings of his non-performance, which Kelly spoke of. And in this letter, he talks about this initially as a non-action. And also his 1993 text, Rewriting History, which is in the publication, which is made up of pre-existing texts, both his own previous artist statements and also divergent historical sources, other voices. This text, I think, shows his discomfort with labels and systems, with language, but also how much value Gordon placed in those who were close to him. His wide knowledge of art and artists he drew inspiration from, his capacity for deep and reflective and even poetic reflection in his words, despite these qualities of uncertainty around the capacity of language. That, I think, is his voice, but it is one that's always moving. There is a restlessness, but a recognition ultimately that sometimes great purpose can be found by opposing expectations, listening carefully to the world, and never standing still. And I quote, "Dear Eugene, I thought I would write you a real letter this time, Eugene, since you're the only person who keeps in touch anyways." I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here. A couple of weeks ago, I went to see the Marcel Brother's retrospective on in Paris. I really liked it a lot, and I have since gotten many ideas through reading a catalogue I bought of his work. One of his ideas really struck a chord was his museum. Jumping ahead a little bit again. Intuitively, I immediately thought of the Museum of Silence. Marcel's museum existed in obscurity, a non-place. It was a conceptual museum set against the usual organizing tendencies of what we know as museums. Museums organize, classify, label, and present the result as part of a continuous historical narrative. This illusion of history informs our present identity as human beings. Actually, it probably doesn't even get that far. I think it stops short of humanness and gets stuck in Europeans, Americans, Australians, etc. National identities, materialist identities, bound up with the narratives of colonialism. Jumping ahead a little bit again. We saw the Moet catalogue the other day, and your three little works look very beautiful among all the rest. The patterns that I saw as mandalas, I saw as being about transcendence of self and of identity in the silence of the museum. And I guess museums are about silence, contemplation, and knowledge, though I think the Museum of Silence is about gnosis. Thus, I see your work as pointing toward a center, to put it crudely, but can it be put any other way with words? My strategy in my art has been to point out what the center is not, what identity is not, especially for Aboriginal people, because as any metaphysician will tell you, a healthy identity is first necessary before any identity can be transcended. And the attitudes too many people have towards Aborigines is demeaning to their own spirits, let alone to us. I see my work a little bit like Ad Reinhardt's, or rather his attitude of refining by defining what art is not. I seek to define what identity is not. Jumping ahead. I had in mind a project, a non-action of say 5 years duration to begin when I return to the old country, and it is my old country. Over this 5 years, I intend to say nothing about my work other than what I have already said in the past. It has become a matter of saying the same things in different ways anyway, so nothing will be lost in this practice. This silence will lay the foundations of a museum. You see, I want to build one. I haven't thought it all through yet, but I'm thinking of the body of work I produce in my silence as building the museum. Statements will constitute quotes by other people and myself, juxtaposed or ordered in particular ways. I've set down some functions of the regional museum. 1, to collect information, historical or contemporary, and redistribute it in newly constructed forms, not in a teleological sequence, but crossing back and forth across time. 2, to collect and order. 3, to collect and reorder. 4, to collect and disorder. 5, to disrupt the chatter of a complacent historical continuum and create silent spaces for thought. 6, to listen to the wind. Thank you.
Right, excuse me, I'm sorry. Can't believe after all this time I'm still didn't unmute. Anyway, sorry for that everyone, but thank you very much to our 4 panelists. Very moving, thoughtful and very insightful, not just the readings you chose, but your reflections on them. So thank you so much. And I could just like to encourage everybody in this short time we have left. We have about a quarter of an hour, and if you'd like to put a question through the Q&A function, I'd be delighted to deal with it. We haven't received questions yet, but we have one nomination of Judy Watson for Prime Minister, so I am extremely proud of that, and I hope that your ticket will be soon be sorted out, Judy. But I would like, can I a question to you already? One thing, looking at Gordon's own office come studio there, while we were talking about, what do you think were the most exciting encounters that Gordon had with books and reading? What were the things he read that seemed to have inspired him? Because we heard in readings that he was obviously deeply read in many sources, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about what it was. I mean, what he read that most inspired him, what fired him.
Well, sorry.
Judy.
Oh, I was just thinking about the Thomas McIlvailey readings that he had looked at. I think, you know, the fact that he was looking at artists like Marcel Brothers. I would say, I mean, I went to Dusseldorf as well, you know, for the Arat Jara show later and the Hayward Gallery, and seeing the Fluxus shows that were on. I don't know, Leanne could sort of inform us better about that. But I would say all of those catalogues by artists, certainly I know he was, you know, very, very moved by a lot of artwork and reading and writing, and very much in his head as well as working with his hands on those pieces at the time. So probably all the things that are in his book, but I think Leanne would be a really good source, and Tim, of exactly what was in his, you know, reading material.
Sure, thank you, Judy. That's amazing. I'd be happy to say a little bit about that if that is helpful. I thought I might add as well Bruce Elder's Blood on the Wattle. I know it was a very crucial text. Another one that sort of appeared a little bit through my research, which I think is really interesting, is the significance of Lucy Lippard's Mixed Blessings book from 1990 about sort of First Nations art from across the world. Gordon's copy of that in his archive is filled with such detailed highlighting and dog-eared pages and text annotations, and he sort of, I think that's where he probably first encountered Adrian Piper's writing, was in that text, because he very heavy pink highlight across that whole section, maybe an exclamation mark or something. So certainly Bruce Elder, Henry Reynolds, but his reading was very broad. I mean, his interests sort of extended into sort of, you know, obviously into psychoanalysis, postmodern theory, you know, Foucault was very important to him, Frantz Fanon, yeah. So there's sort of some sort of more of the typical kind of post-colonial kind of theorist, but then it is also incredibly broad. He also loved science fiction novels, so.
Again, sorry, it's on mute. I just wondered if anyone else had any further comment on that, or whether you'd like to. We've had some questions about why this, what the genesis of this particular project of collective writings was. I wondered if at the risk of making you work even harder, Tim, just say what it was and how maybe it came about.
Sure. Thanks, Marcos. It's a great question. I mean, from many sort of things, I guess I spoke a little bit about sort of my kind of context and sort of interaction with Gordon's work and archive. So through my thesis and looking at his notes, I guess I kind of came to kind of, you know, understand, I think as most people do, the sort of the beauty of Gordon's writing. And it was interesting to me how even texts like the manifesto are hard to get your hands on. That hardcover book is out of print to my knowledge, the 96 one with Ian McLean. It was reproduced in the IMA publication, which is fantastic. But I think the more places that it's accessible, the better. So while I was doing the thesis, Angela Goddard sort of reached out to me and sort of said, would you like to kind of, you know, start working together? And we yeah, it's something that kind of came out of those discussions, was this thought of, you know, there's such potency to Gordon's words, and there's such a breadth as well to the subjects that he covers. And yes, there's, you know, engagement with sort of political situation, but there's also such beautiful poetic sort of reflection. There's one of my favorite short texts is a poem that Gordon wrote on the back of a postcard that he sent to Peter Bellis, where he's kind of, you know, it's kind of a freewheeling kind of experimental little moment. So there is that sort of depth, I think, expressed in the publication. So yeah, so it was that kind of cumulative experience of reading and feeling like this is something that should be compiled and it should be accessible for current artists, future artists, because that's something we come across so much, is the number of artists working today who cite Gordon and of course Judy's work as well as being sort of very influential for their sort of practice and understanding. So yeah.
Well, we're certainly very glad you and Angela did get it. I mean, obviously we're very proud of the result, but we've had a couple of other questions I'd love to get to before we wrap up, and one of which I think is quite profound. I hope I'm summing it up properly. That to the whole group of you, how much do you think that did Gordon feel he had gone some way to addressing those concerns that, you know, that he is making plain as an artist? I suppose this is a question about whether he felt he had, in fact, you know, made some way towards the way that what Stephen was talking about, you know, what is an artist to do? You know, he has a very profound critique. Did he feel his own art had gone some way to answer that critique, or to help with it, or to achieve something? Would anyone like to take that? It's a hard question. It's a good one, though.
I'll have a go. That is a very good question and a difficult one. I suppose I could answer it in a roundabout way. I don't think Gordon felt that way about his practice. I think it comes through the publication, but he was extraordinarily humble and quite, despite his success, I think both skeptical of it and what that brought, but also it never embedded itself in a great sense of confidence or is that fair, Judy? But I also think it, in some ways it wasn't about never about him. So I don't think he would probably have reflected on it as I've gone so far with this, because the endeavour was beyond him. The endeavour was society. Structural racism, you know, colonisation and its ongoing impacts. And, you know, it's also why I think we see that his work continues increasingly to reverberate and have relevance internationally, because the job isn't done. Yeah. So in some ways there was although the work was deeply personal and really did take a personal toll, I don't think he would have ever sat back and just wasn't the kind of person who would have thought, oh, well, job done, or isn't this fantastic? The drive to create was about communication and change.
I think the fact that he, I remember the Sue Smith article, and I think that was something where he could have stepped away from it, but he actually answered that. And so he did, that was an attempt to, not just for him, but I'd say for other Aboriginal people and other people, just to refute this complete misunderstanding and miseducation and a lost opportunity to actually talk about these issues by a journalist who was going to have some sort of impact upon the readership of whoever reads the Courier Mail. But, you know, it's such a rag paper, like so many of them. But at the same time, this was an art journalist within the scene. And I think it was any time you get some of these reflections that are incredibly racist and patronising and lost opportunities, it's something that's going to be felt by, you know, generations beyond. And I think that, you know, to take a stand and write a letter back was really strong. I was also thinking about, you know, Tracy Moffat's work, Scarred for Life, and how those deep woundings are part of, you know, your childhood or sort of teenagehood growing up, you know, as Stephen was saying as well. And that was what Gordon and I did talk about a little bit. And, you know, I think for everybody who was within Australia at that time and now as well, you have certain ways of being seen and being depicted, and the capacity or incapacity of people around you who may be full of entitlement, who cannot see your point of view or cannot put themselves into your position, your shoes, and feel what it feels like to actually have that deep wounding and scarification upon your psyche and upon your family.
If anyone else wants to make a comment, otherwise we do have another question, another hard one too. What do you think has not been thought or said about Gordon? What are the ways that we're going to be understanding him in new ways, or how might the next couple of decades bring a new understanding of Gordon and his work? Yes.
I would like to say just one thing quickly. I know that Leanne and Gordon were both looking at those early readers. I would love to see education which shows those early readers alongside Gordon's work and alongside Gordon's questioning. So it's a really clear mapping of how we were miseducated and then how Gordon sought to refute, you know, that education through his artwork, and then lay it out as groundwork for the student to see, well, how are they going to go ahead? How are they going to see themselves within our society now?
Other comments from anyone on that question of Gordon in the next 2 decades?
I guess from my perspective with, I don't know, I was curious with like my thesis, like there's always this need to kind of like articulate a new position, and it's certainly with Gordon, it's an interesting one, kind of coming back to Rex's question. When an artist has had so much written about him, and I think in the context of the reasoning for doing this book of like championing his voice amongst that, I understand at points in Gordon's career, he was exhausted with the idea of having to kind of constantly justify what his practice was about or what he was trying to do with his work. And so he did rely on other writers like Ian McLean, of course, to sort of speak for him in a way. So there's a lot of text, and so trying to kind of articulate a new position amongst that is a difficult one. But what I kind of like came to was this idea of, you know, would it be possible to kind of think of Gordon's work outside of the context of postmodernism and post-colonialism? Like I think it has this sort of greater sort of impact internationally. Yes, it emerges within those contexts, and Gordon spoke about them as being very central. But there's points, you know, at the end of Notes to Basquiat, he says that he's just exhausted and he needs to step away. And as Kelly mentioned, the Stripe series becomes this sort of opportunity of sort of for freedom. He wanted to always be an abstract painter. And so there's these attempts at kind of escaping from these kind of logics of these theories that he found kind of suffocating at times, I think, or at least what I read through his writing. So one way of trying to kind of think through maybe a new avenue was this interest in conceptualism that is only kind of touched briefly in the existing scholarship. It's referred to in passing. Terry Smith sort of notes it in the Global Conceptualism text when he's reflecting on Australia and New Zealand at that time. But so that's sort of one avenue that I've been like looking at a little bit more.
Thanks. I am really sorry, everyone, but we probably have to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So thank you for the very lively questions and Q&A comments that you've all provided, and thank you for turning up on everybody on a Saturday morning. I want to thank those our wonderful participants once again. So Judy, to Kelly, to Tim, and to Stephen, thank you so much. Your words were very perceptive. The readings were very moving, and I think we really sort of helped understand the profound resonance and importance of Gordon Bennett and his work and his writing for our generations and those to come. So I want to say congratulations to all involved in this book. 10% discount with our special code for all of those who turned up on Saturday morning, and indeed all of those who go to Quagoma and use their code. It's a wonderful book. It's worth double the money. Please buy as many copies as possible. Christmas is coming. I want to say thank you again to everyone for attending, and especially to our panelists and to all those, and to my great colleague Nick Croggan, who behind the scenes and unseen by everyone else has organised this event to make it possible and to make it so smooth in the running. So thank you to Nick, thank you to Marnie, and to all the team responsible for the book, and especially to our 4 panelists and everyone involved in today's discussion. Thanks again, enjoy the show, and I hope you'll be ringing the cash registers and reading the book in the next minutes. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks, and I'll say goodbye now.